Welcome back to the Moms Like Me podcast, powered by Support Now, where we get to talk to all different types of moms that are experiencing different major life moments, some that are more sudden, some that are more chronic. And along this journey, I get to meet some really incredible women. And Sarah, our guest today, Kernion, is the epitome of someone that you just meet and you just automatically connect with. So I'm super excited about this conversation today. First of all, I know you'll plug your website at the end. It is the most vibrant, joyful brand that just completely exemplifies you and your personality and your entire approach to life. So Sarah, I am so thrilled to have you on the podcast today. Welcome.
Jordan, thanks for having me. I appreciate your words. And sometimes whenever we're learning to accept compliments, it's hard to say thank you, but thank you.
You're welcome.
I've been really leaning into being the best version of who I am. And I'm glad that pops off when it comes to my socials and in-person chats. So thanks.
No, it completely does. And not that I don't love all of our guests. There's just certain people, though, that are so easy to talk to. And you are one of those people. So Sarah, for people that aren't familiar with who you are and Saturday's story and really, honestly, just the whole topic of neurodiversity, which you are so passionate about, please give us kind of your elevator pitch. Who are you? What got you here?
Oh, man. Right. So Saturday's story began when I first became a mother back in 2012. And I was in that early stage mommy blogger world where Tumblr was the hit and Weebly was popular and Instagram was just beginning. This is like late 2012 into 2013. And I experienced a really severe postpartum anxiety/psychoses chapter of my first-time motherhood. And I started to use the platform on Instagram to share really openly about that. That was innately and is innately who I am. And I thought to myself, I actually don't feel any shame over this. And if I can connect and form community based on a really scary life phase that I've gotten through, I'm going to keep doing that. I joke that the universe said, hold my beer, because I really thought that my postpartum, 6 months of this is really scary and I am losing my mind over routines and schedules. And then truly thought to myself, if I just keep writing about this is the hill that I will, chat and connect with for the rest of my life. Well, that was not in the plans. And I was living in Manhattan at the time. I'd lived in Manhattan for over 10 years. And I really started leaning into sharing when I was pregnant with my second daughter. And I leaned and learned a lot about the studies coming out of University of Chicago through Dr. Emily Oster. And she wrote a book called Expecting Better. So I thought, let's change the story on my motherhood the second time around. Let's put everything else aside from what I learned from my firstborn and lean into this pregnancy being different, my expectations being pushed off to the side, and really try to focus on the present moment of my second daughter's life being hers. Moved to the suburbs, and I had Millie, and I really did lean into that mindset of not comparing my first daughter to my second. My first daughter was the one that in a small Upper West Side apartment, you said to her to not touch the stove, and she didn't touch the stove. So not having that with the second child was really tough. But I thought, well, now I'm living in a home that's 10 times the size of my apartment. Maybe there's just more stimulation. And I really leaned into just the acceptance of different children. Around a year old was when I started to notice that the development of Millie was atypical. And yet I still leaned on the fact that I knew that every child was going to present itself differently to me. When I voiced my concerns to the pediatrician, I was given a very clear, rote definition of she's a girl and she's making eye contact. So through this whole process, I was still writing on Saturday's story about not comparing my two daughters. And it really wasn't until Millie was about 18 months old, right before January of 2017, I had already become pregnant with my son at the time. And when I began voicing my concern more and more, it was less about comparing and more about realizing that Millie was telling me through her behaviors who she was. So I began sort of evolving that mentality of, I'm not just expecting them to be different, but I'm seeing something of what how her behaviors are communicating to me, something drastically atypical. And so I shared on my Instagram about that journey and about my questions and about beginning early intervention and really just being confused about what that even meant for her. As I say in all my keynotes that I give, the universe said, hold my beer and then hold it again a second time, because it was when my son was only 7 days old in late October of 2017 that Millie got an autism diagnosis. And the time from when I began early intervention through the time of the diagnosis, being pregnant with my son through that whole process, walloped my mind and heart in a way that I can only describe as being on the rock bottom of my 31-year-old self. It was grief in a way that was so untangible because it wasn't like I lost a child, but I had lost the idea of the child who I expected to raise, even within the individuality of her being my second child. I had lost the life that I had envisioned for myself when that diagnosis hit. And to say that it hit me like a Mack truck wrapped in a pink bow, it did. And I couldn't speak to it outside of my sister and my best friend for a really long time. And it was a phase where I'm so happy that I have gone through now and came out on the other side with the mindset that I have. But I just really continue to write all about having a typical daughter at the time, going through all the therapies and evaluations for Millie, and at the same time I had a newborn. So it was a really insanely humbling and yet like catastrophically fundamentally changed who I was as a person. It just fundamentally changed me.
Let me ask you, I appreciate so much just the honest, transparent description of how you felt. Because I think a lot of people like to put up this front that I love my daughter, I love my children no matter what. And so I think it's super constructive to be honest about this. You talked about grief. You talked about how, the expectation you had would be different. I know enough about you to know that you've probably done a lot of work to figure out why that was so challenging for you, why that was so disturbing, why that kept you up at night. Can you share what you found in the work that you've done to figure out not just that it wasn't going to be what you expected, but what deeper was inside of you that made you feel so reluctant to share and accept?
I realized specifically my postpartum anxiety phase with my first child, that we as mothers, first-time mothers and as women, have been sold a narrative or have been just conditioned to a narrative of what our choices in life as successful, intelligent, well-educated women is to look like, as you said, on the path towards marriage and motherhood. And when the cards blew over for me, I began to question why I had been so sold on this being the only path that I saw that was going to happen. I literally couldn't understand how that was no longer the path that I was on, because with having my first child, it was like I could write a book on motherhood, but I was given no merit for that. I mean, she is who she is, and she showed me who she was since she was born, just like Millie. I was so sad that I was not going to have the set of sisters that I anticipated. I have a younger sister, and our friendship and sisterhood has evolved, as we've aged. I was so scared because no one I had known had this happen. I was angry that on top of everything else, I now had a child who truly deserved and also required so much input from me and realizing that I also had a newborn to take care of too. So I truly didn't know how I was going to function. That I think I will say I really felt bad for myself. I mean, there were moments I was like, is this really who this is happening to? You know, people say they look up to God or to the heavens and they go, why? I think I was literally like, am I like I remember like touching myself and being like, okay, I'm here. Yep, this is me. This is who this is happening to. I was so confused. I was just so confused. And I also think that the work that I did in sharing allowed for me to realize that while it was happening to me, I was starting to see that I wasn't unique in this experience. Like, I was not the first person to have 2 daughters and have her second child have non-speaking autism. And I certainly, as I went forward and accepted my own, reality, that when my son was diagnosed, I still wasn't unique. Like, there are still people out there that have 3 or more children, that have 2 children with non-speaking autism. Like that, I know that I'm not unique. And so utilizing what I knew to be true is sharing vulnerably, letting everyone else know they're not alone, and knowing that I was able to write about my experience in a way that resonated became this like one step in front of the other next thing.
So what you just did there, I think is so healthy, right? It's like, you're not unique,
I knew it.
and it's hard. Those two things are not in conflict.
Right. And I knew that it was unique to me, and it was unique to everyone I knew in my circles and my social circles and my family. Like, I knew I was unique then, but on a major scale, I was like, okay, find peace in that this has happened before. And someone's going through this right now, even though I didn't know who those people were.
Okay, so let's kind of take this a little bit more into the future. You've now gone through all the grief all the grief stages, the sadness, the shock, the sadness, the anger, all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
You're on this other side of it. Let's call it acceptance, right? I'm sure there still are moments and waves of grief, and just like anyone. What would you tell the mom who just found out that their son or daughter has a non-speaking, nonverbal autism diagnosis?
I can say this now with deep clarity. Your child being exactly who they are is actually going to inform you more about who you are and become your greatest teacher in the importance of what life is really about. There's sayings, throughout time of, you're worthy just by being born. Like, you are born worthy of life and happiness and love and joy and the experience of being a human. Having a child diagnosed is going to remind you of that every single day. Because when I realized that the diagnosis was only going to help Millie show me who she is through different schooling and different therapies and a team of support that I didn't know that occupational therapy even existed outside of someone having like a stroke. Like, I truly didn't even, I couldn't even tell you what occupational therapy was probably. I thought it was occupation based, like, okay, someone used to be this, they need to learn how to XYZ again. Like, if they're a teacher, they lost function in their hand, they learn run on a chalkboard again. Like, I didn't even know. And so realizing that she was now going to get all these services to allow me to understand who she is and how she best learns, it only informed me of myself. And that is the greatest gift I can say to first-time parents of their child being diagnosed, is that it's so scary, but if you allow yourself to realize that the more you understand your child, the more you're going to understand yourself, it is like such an aha moment.
So my next question is, how did you take care of yourself in those early days? You talked about early on, you shared with a family and a close friend.
Mm-hmm.
But how did you begin to cope? Like, what were the tactics that you used to help you kind of go through all of these cycles and stages of grief?
I was very, open with my best friend and my sister, my closest, confidants, and my groups of friends from home and college. I'm would be remiss if I didn't say this. I am divorced from my children's father, and there is a high divorce rate among special needs parents. That being said, my ex-husband is works on Wall Street and has crazy hours. So I actually got a live-in au pair when this diagnosis went down, and that was not a replacement for me at all, but it at least allowed me to press pause because I didn't even have a partner that was around ever. So my ability to say the kids are going to be fine, they can just watch TV with the au pair, and everyone's going to be safe. That was, and I know that comes from such a place of privilege. Like, I'm very, very aware of that. I didn't have family. I don't have family nearby. So I didn't have a mom. I didn't have a set of in-laws. I didn't have a dad that was able to provide like that familial loving care at all. On top of the fact that of the ones that were somewhat close regionally, to ask and expect a loving acceptance in return of watching Millie, who was exhibiting such deep behavioral patterns, was very scary to a lot of other people, right? And it's still something that is, I guess, a journey that I'm on with how family members and how friends accept the need for the help that I ask for, because it doesn't look the same. And you have
Mm,
to just scrape that down. But when in those first days of self-care, it was as simple, Jordan, as going up into my bedroom and locking the door with a cup of coffee. It
mm.
was not anything luxurious at all. My favorite self-care is just going to New York City and walking around and people watching and listening to podcasts and music. That wasn't even available to me at that time. So it was very, very small moments of, silence in my bedroom, or yoga in my bathroom, right? Steaming up the bathroom to do a little bit of hot yoga. It was very, very minimal. And to be honest, while it makes me sad that I couldn't do more, I'm really proud that I did at least that. That was one of those things I look back on with hindsight is, yeah, it didn't make me float through those phases, but it carried me in some small way that at least I began acknowledging that I did need a moment to myself during the day when the meltdowns were happening. Have the au pair give my son a bottle. Like, I chose it even though it graded against all that I knew to be true. I knew I had to choose it. So even if it was small, I did.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying, though, is so important. It's similar to what you described earlier. It's these little things that you learn to appreciate and have gratitude for. By the way, I think a lot of moms experience that regardless of
Totally.
the health of your child. Suddenly a shower feels like vacation. We've all seen these Instagram memes or reels of moms that just are just sitting in their car with a coffee because it's
And
quiet
you're
and
like,
it's
"I'm in Saint Tropez right now." Like, I always I am literally like, I'm on the Isle, like, I'm somewhere not here right now, and I can't believe that this small thing is that luxurious.
Yeah, I mean, it really like motherhood reframes space and time. It's just magnified in a situation where you're so overcome with grief. And the reality is that your life is harder than a lot of other moms might encounter because the degree that you have to be on emotionally, physically, like
Yes.
spiritually, you have to bring your entire self.
The best way to describe it is, like, think about those times when you had a typical newborn,
Mhm.
and then you had another typical newborn, like, space, but that first newborn still needed you in the capacity that you did as a newborn. It just, now their needs change, but those needs you did not anticipate having to be in charge of. So it's as simple as a babysitter for my typical 2.5-year-old. I'd say, "Oh, yeah, she's potty trained, she can have whatever snacks she wants. We'll be back at 10 o'clock. She goes to bed at 8. Read books, sound machine on go." That takes a lot for a typical mom to do, right? To leave your child for the first time. Well, then you think about it, if you bring a regular babysitter over and my 9-year-old is not potty trained, if I can say to them, everything's gonna be fine. You're going to need to take Millie to the bathroom. She's likely 90% of the time going to sit, pull it back up and go, but you got to keep trying. Oh, by the way, Mac, like it's like running a nursery, but for children that are older, and it really can confuse your mind. And that's where I think a lot of the grief comes from, is like you're just so confused as to how what you think about development no longer exists.
Well, and there are such constructs around motherhood and what it should look like and what it should feel like. And of course, social media perpetuates the worst of this, where everyone makes it look easy. And yeah, I think influencers and creators have gotten better at
I
this,
agree.
trying to be a little bit more honest. And it just defies what your impression of what this phase of life would look like. You know, you expect once your kid turns 5, I'm just making this up to be generous, your kids are potty trained and you're just past that phase of life and it's one less thing.
And you
One less
experienced it, and you're so happy that you experienced it, and you're like moving on. I mean, this is the beauty of aging. It's like we get to do this. We get to do this. And when that goes away and you're like, I remember thinking consciously when I had my son, and this is even when Millie was diagnosed. I remember this is before I even realized the capacity of what was actually going to be the reality of being Millie and Mac's mom. I still remember thinking, okay, he's a newborn. I have 4.5 years. I'll be back to work. Like that thought process of like, once the youngest is in kindergarten, the next trajectory of life will come over. And to know that that wasn't going to happen was like, that is like is a knee jerk, or is a like a quick break. Like you kind of just get pulled back and you're like, oh my God, that's not going to happen now, is it?
Sarah, how hard is it, or is this hard, was this hard to be the autism mom, to be the mom of the kids with autistic kids? And I mean that from the sense of lack of play dates, lack of interaction. I also mean that in the sense of like everyone wanting to be, or maybe people wanting to be helpful, and you're like, I just don't want to be always labeled. Like,
Yeah.
how have you balanced that, and how do you navigate that?
I don't know. I don't know if this is how I was raised. I have let the whole like I haven't had the time to really let the typical things that I expected, now that I'm so on the train and like it's like moving and grooving, and everything's like well oiled, and we're on this path. I did not have the time to hold space for, oh, Millie doesn't have a play date. Like I have thought about that, and I have done the things to change and give her those experiences, but it's not as much as you would think, because I'm so grounded in Millie's different way of living and her education, that I think I almost was like so thankful that I experienced that typical with my first. And like, okay, now we're just on this, and her social and emotional development is going to look so wildly different. I will tell you though, as someone who is very social and leaned into, the social world in Central Jersey after living in the city, it was a weird thing to realize that people would say, oh my God, I heard someone like, have you talked to Sarah? Oh, she's got 2 autistic kids. Have you talked to Sarah? And, it can be funny. You're like, I'm not just the autism mom. Like I'm the mom, and people, my closest friends know this, like I'm the mom that if something miraculous happened, they're like, hey, we've got 2 tickets to Barcelona that are free. Like I'm the first one to raise my hand. Now, that's not that I can say necessarily do it, but like I live a fast life. I like that. I've always loved, and maybe that goes along with my choice to always get out in the world and interact with all my kids. But it is weird. I will say I've learned to just own that, because I'm realizing that when people say, have you talked to Sarah? Have you talked to Sarah Kernion? It is such a compliment. It is such a compliment, because they're acknowledging that I was vulnerable enough to talk about this. But it is strange. It's strange.
Yeah, it's just it's you're wearing like another cape of,
Yeah.
the hero that swoops in with all the
Yeah, it
advice and the
is.
perspective, and that's not a bad
Right?
thing. I just think it's an interesting thing to call out, because I see this happen a lot, even in my personal life, where if someone has experience with a certain type of kid, that mom is labeled that thing, and which is accurate. And I wonder, I'm like, is that frustrating? That is just
Yeah.
the thing that everyone knows you for, because you're also like, "Well, I'm still this person that still has these interests, these passions. I'm not just the autism mom. I'm not just the mom with a kid who had cancer. I also
Right.
have, so many different layers to me." So I think that's just I think it's an important thing to talk about, because you have to normalize, like, all the layers of someone, not just, like, the one thing that you might know them for, despite it being the most well-intended thing.
Yeah, it's so well intended, and I always think it goes back to women, the primal wiring of tending and befriending. We're wired to, one, notice mismatches in society, right? Like, we are literally wired as humans, like male or female, to notice mismatches in society. So I'm a mismatch, right? Like, it's apparent when I'm out in my community that I'm a mismatch, and I have children that do not look like yours, and because of that, the tending and befriending of other moms to sort of showcase that, I know it always comes from a good spot. I'm a firm believer in Brené Brown's one phrase, which is not like necessarily her most famous one, but she says, "If you what is the most generous response that you can give?" So I tend to not look at being sort of labeled like, "Oh, the person that you talk to with neurodivergent kids." I think of people that's a really generous thing to say. They were just thinking of me and knowing what I'm really, like, open and honest about.
Right.
So, less about the label and more about it being a compliment to how I live.
So we cannot leave this podcast today without you explaining a little bit more about a term that I learned first from you. And I want to give time for you to explain this, because I think it's such a beautiful way. First time we ever spoke, you introduced this idea of an inch stone to
Mhm.
me. So not a milestone, but an inchstone. To I'll try to summarize from my interpretation, is that almost like narrowing the strike zone and kind of reframing, especially when you have not neurotypical children, like what the expectations are, instead of looking at it from the spectrum of what a neurotypical kid would do, rather to measure it in these inchstones. So tell me more about that. I think it's such a smart term, and one that people can find a lot of value in.
So, any parent knows when you become a first-time parent and you go to a pediatrician, likely like the day or 2 after you come home from the hospital. You go into your pediatrician office and you are likely either handed or given a pamphlet on, like, the stages of development in, like, the first year of your child's life. And it's likely something like milestones in the first year. Like, the word milestone is so hammered into your brain, not by, like, strong force, but it is a word and it is a noun that is not used much outside of child development. And for some reason, we start absorbing that as parents and using it almost as like a barometer of your own success as a parent. I mean, I remember, not to throw my mom under the bus, but she still to this day will say to people, "Oh, your brother, I mean, he walked at 8 months." And I like first of all, my brother is like wildly neurodivergent too, which is like ironic in and of itself. But like she hung her hat on like Jackson walking and talking really young. So this is not even a millennial generation thing. This is like boomers and like the silent generation. Like they experience this too, or like always being told, these are the things that you need to meet for your child to be a success. And it broke me very early on when Millie was not meeting those typical developmental milestones. And yet, every time I went into the doctor's office, she had aged and she was healthy and she had gained skills. And I kept asking, why are we forcing her to be on this timeline when that spectrum of development does not coincide with who Millie actually is?
Mhm.
And general pediatricians were very accepting of that, but I just quickly realized that I was going to celebrate Millie's journey to whatever time it took for her to meet a milestone, which honestly, she might talk one day, with her voice box and communicate like that. it might be a milestone, but not from a typical definition of it. And so I really began celebrating the smaller building blocks of a skill for Millie and then subsequently for Mac, and called them my inchstones. And I honestly have no idea how that term, surfaced for me. It's definitely a word that I believe had been like used in the special needs parenting world, but it was not something that I had thought, wow, this is a life lens. This is a mindset choice of how I can be the best mom for them so that they can grow and develop. And there's no my typical oldest is on a x-axis and we're on the y. And there is no crossover there that's going to make anyone's life different or better if I force her to be on that one of her sisters. So we celebrated things like touching Play-Doh. We celebrated things like one Duplo block on top of another Duplo block. We celebrated popping bubbles. And it's not because I was trying to, promote atypical development. It was just that it allowed me to find joy in the smaller moments because in a lot of ways I was being told to not celebrate the development of my child. And that's what it is. Yeah. So we've kind of run with it, and we've gone full throttle on realizing that it actually can be put forth for your typical child as well. Because as you realize as a parent, no child is what you envision them to be. Not a single one. Not a single one. And my oldest exhibits so much of me in like 90% of the ways, and she's still not anything what I would have thought. So we celebrate those small things that she does too. But it's so individual, and inchstones over milestones has become a way to really celebrate the reality of a life that no one wakes up in Manhattan and goes, I want 2 kids with non-speaking autism. Like, you just don't, that's not like, it's not on my bingo card. Like I always say, like, that was not on the bingo card, let alone one and having 2. So being able to be present to the small wins of, like I said, the touching Play-Doh, rolling Play-Doh, trying a new food, experiencing a loud party, going to a new museum, and then also realizing that those experiences that were got to be celebrated also were likely on such a smaller scale too. Yeah. Went to a birthday party for a quarter of the time. We still did it. We still gained something from it. And that rose up very quickly for me because I knew I didn't want to live a life of what she wasn't doing, and I wanted to celebrate what she was. And her brother, but Millie's my number one teacher.
I just think it's such a great perspective. I think it's such a good reframe, not just for parenting. I think it's a great reframe for business. I think it's a great reframe for life, because we live in such a busy culture. Everything's hustle, hustle, hustle. And in that, we get lost. We get lost in all the things that we're accomplishing, all the things we get to do, all the things that we've already achieved. I think it's such a powerful way of looking at life, not just from the lens of what your kids are doing, but what we as moms are capable of as well. I mean, that's so much of that gets lost. I mean, the millions of things that we accomplish in a day that we don't take 2 seconds to appreciate. Wow, I did all of that.
Yeah, and when you rattle it back, whether it's your child doing what another mom might think is just any other day, it still puts it back on, that's my life. Like I always say, like, I cannot give to you, Jordan, right now. I cannot give you the understanding of what it is a day in my life. I just can't. That's impossible. But what I can give you is the idea that how good it feels to celebrate something on the smallest scale, whether it's about your kids, your business development, your marriage, anything. If you can celebrate that you did make that 1% made the needle move 1%, it is worthy of internal pride and celebration.
Yeah, appreciation. I heard something recently on a Mel Robbins podcast as well, just about you got to do the reps, and like it's
Reps,
just
yep.
it's just showing up and doing the reps. And I think again, we get so lost in seeing the before and after and these extremes
Yes. Yeah.
of, look at my kid, how the kid was yesterday and look at where he is today. It's like, but all of those like micro wins, those micro just changes and evolutions are so dramatic. And again, it allows you to appreciate the journey so much more, because what ends up happening when you don't is now you're just always looking ahead. You're always looking ahead to the next big thing, and it's just so unhealthy for us as parents and for our kids, because you're basically saying that it's never enough.
It's never enough. And that's well, and then that goes back to what I was saying at first, is that when you are born, you are enough. Like, and so that mentality, and even going back to how exhausting and sort of the caregiving role that it is for who I am with Millie and Mac, the muscle that I flex in being so vigilant to their lives and having to keep them safe and to keep them, truly like fed and hydrated and all those things. When I'm not with them, I'm more present. I'm more mindful of where I am. I'm where my feet are. I love my oldest daughter. I would not have been like that had I just had my oldest. Because you know why? We would have been exactly what you said. Where are we going next? What's the next trip we're taking? Where are we staying the next trip we're taking? Like, instead of being present to planning the trip, how much fun it is to anticipate. Like, it's given me so much more in the terms of being where my feet are, that, yeah, it's not just about Millie's inchstone. It's about everyone's ability to be where they are.
I love it. Sarah, I could literally talk to you for hours. I think the way you articulate your whole path, and again, the inchstones thing is so brilliant. And the energy that you have behind it, the humor that you have behind it is it's so delightful. It really is so delightful. Thank you so much. My question is, where can people find you that want to take on more of your content, your brand, or want to inject more of you into their life?
So I kept Saturday's story, because we always started off as Saturday's story around here, sharing about the little things on a good old Saturday. So my company is Saturday's Story, www.saturdaystory.com. I post a lot of the real life inchstone wins on my social media accounts by the same name on Instagram. And as of last month, I've launched my own podcast as well, called Inchstones by Saturday's Story, to share exactly that, the ways in which autism has affected my family and friends, bringing on clinicians, therapists, people that are a part of the world that I'm in, but also those who have seen the joys that are brought about because of my children being who they are. So there's that as well. And Substack will be launched soon for all the really nitty gritty, because there are some parents that really want to know some of the very dirty ins and outs.
I love it. I love it. As a parting note as well, one of the things that I enjoy about this podcast is it also provides resources. So Sarah and everything she mentioned is a resource. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention, from a Support Now perspective, we are there. We are there for families with an autism diagnosis. And as Sarah mentioned earlier, you might not be in a place where you can afford an au pair, and you might need additional resources. And part of the heart behind what we've built is that your community can come alongside of you in so many different ways, whether that's money, meals, volunteers, or simply just updating people on the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month reality. And so if you notice someone that may be earlier in the journey, or maybe not early in the journey, that could benefit from this, please consider Support Now as an additional vehicle to, again, inform your community and allow them to be a part of your journey. I always believe that people do care. They want to support. You just have to give them a place to deposit that. And hopefully you'll find that with Support Now. So
I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the ability to search for respite care on the registry is huge. It is a common topic that comes up so often within my small niche community, because that self-care and the ability to put your own oxygen mask on before you take care of your kids is valid to the most real extent in the special needs population and medical mom community. So that is one of the coolest things about what the registry and advocacy Abby have done.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that. Sarah, many more conversations to come. Thank you for joining us
Yes.
today.
Awesome. Thanks, Jordan.